In the early 2010s, it was very hard to not find one of the 5 Trauma Center games at a used store. Picking up Second Opinion was one of the best things I could have done, and luckily, there were multiple other Trauma games that just kept improving in all aspects. My favorite thing about them? Well, they have incredible gameplay, gorgeous art, and great music. But beyond that, the criticisms of the American healthcare system and lack of empathy among doctors strikes me now more than ever, especially in an America post-assassination of a CEO. Believe it or not, the series actually gets scarily close to covering the same topics. This will be a video exploring the successes and failures of the Trauma Center games, as well as a deep dive on the development process, and a further look into what they were truly saying, without spoiling too much plot. In 2005, Atlus was experimenting with the PS2, pumping out things like Steambot Chronicles, Digital Devil Saga, and Samurai Western. All of these are very unique and individual, even in today's terms, with interesting choice systems and the like. Around this point, the DS was a very favorable system among every region, with tons of ingenuity. Atlus wanted to make a statement on it, just as they were with the PS2, and apparently, a surgical game was something they'd cooked up scenarios for in the past, which is why the DS got Trauma Center, Under the Knife. The director, Kazuya Nino, was doing quite a bit of directing for DS Atlus games, but he and the producer, Katsura Hashino, really got Trauma Center off the ground with a fantastic first entry. The DS stylus and touchscreen combo worked very well for precise surgeries, and the story carries you through daily drama, medical worker doubts, all the way to an over-the-top dystopian ending. Pre-release, many ads and screenshots had people assuming the game would be more of a point-and-click adventure, but in an interview with Nintendo Inside, Nino was sure to say that he intends it to be seen as an adventure game. Personally, I would call Trauma Center a series akin to the arcade antics of Crazy Taxi, mixed with a very small droplet of Gran Turismo. It bases itself in a real-world medical science simulation with very real scenarios and fears, to then switch gears into an otherworldly virus that swims around in a tummy and gets lasered out. While the plot was influenced by things like Chicago Hope, Blackjack, and other doctor-centered media, the scenario is entirely Atlus-coded, with an end-of-the-world plot and all. I would say the game leans more into the goofiness than the severity of later game themes, but it's serviceable, and the focus is gameplay over story. So let's talk about difficulty. All Trauma Center games are rather hard, with narrow time frames to complete the surgery in, a multitude of things can go wrong at once, vitals can hit 0, and the patient dies, on top of some vague explanations for what to do during the operation. In the interview mentioned before, Nino said,
"There's also been a trend in games lately to have no real lost state whatsoever and just essentially let players keep moving forward until they reach the end. Trauma Center isn't that sort of game. We've limited the number of hints players can find on purpose in favor of just letting them learn the mechanics more organically as they play through levels repeatedly."
I can appreciate that. Like most Atlus games, well, back then, difficulty was used purposefully so that when you finally nailed it, a girl was fist bumping. I will say, especially with the next game we're talking about and its Wii controls, irritation creeps in, but it's not so bad that I give up and quit. There's just enough to get you heated to the point that you have to overcome it. With that being said, they give you a single crutch, the healing touch. Apparently, medicinal gods once granted doctors a magical ability to slow down time in order to stop the patient from dying during a hectic surgery. In the future setting of 2018, our main character Derek Stiles has been given this gift. The healing touch pops up in Second Opinion, which we're getting to very soon, as well as New Blood and the DS sequel to Second Opinion called Under the Knife 2. The amount of things that can go wrong during surgery is easier completed when you're using this feature. On the DS, you can draw a 5-pointed star quite swiftly at pretty much any time you want. On the Wii, you have to hold B and Z, then draw the star with the remote. But it sucks. It hardly worked for me and caused so much frustration because you must draw the star in the exact right order. I'll talk more in detail about motion controls as I break down each game, but let it be known that Second Opinion is awesome until you're forced into using the stupid healing touch. Before we move on, Under the Knife has a totally different art style than the rest of the games, with SMT artist Maguro Ikehara at the helm. His art style is certainly not bad, with good poses, interesting outfits, and nice color schemes, but it's not to my taste. His inspiration feels very of the time, with manga like Welcome to the NHK and maybe even Elephant Lead. It's very soft and somewhat cutesy in a way that the future artist does not do. With that being said, the UI is very clear and does a great job not blocking the main focus. And I quite like the very blue look everything has. It's a nice spin on the typical over-sterile white associated with hospitals. I also want to let you know that I'm actually a pretty squeamish person when it comes to medical things. Yes, I'll watch every hardcore horror film, but start talking to me about a tumor removal and I'll probably fall over. If you're like that, these games may make you feel a bit of a tingle, but the way the cuts and injuries are displayed do great in not feeling realistic. Again, this is an arcade game, not a simulator. With that, it's time we jump into the 2006 Wii launch game Trauma Center Second Opinion, an improved remake of the DS release with a new scenario, further developed characters, minor voice acting, better music, and an intricate control scheme. It's honestly such a great remake that it nearly wipes out the need to go back to the original. The UI and overall graphical upgrade is really nice and clean, but because it was such a rush project to get it out on time for the Wii launch, the game is not in 16:9, nor is it able to be played in progressive scan, so you do see some extra fuzziness that won't be in later releases. The new artist, Masayuki Doi, best known for his SMT4 and 5 designs, added a great amount of depth and connection between the player and the characters. Each one looks so unique and has so much personality in just their poses. Atlus games and their portraits are greatly important in connecting with the story, and Doi always does his damnedest making sure these characters stick with you. Besides the art and visuals, there are very small bits of voice acting with Yuri Lowenthal and many other familiar Persona 3 and 4 era actors making a small contribution. This becomes much more important later on when the plot gets more serious, but the music steps up too. Kenichi Tsuchiya, who most recently composed the Persona 3 Reload OST, which I half liked, did great work on Second Opinion, and it fills in the gaps on how we're supposed to be feeling. I've also got to add that I always get a little tickle of nostalgia when I see the overworld map displayed with the pin as to where we're located. It's just so SMT. Second Opinion's storyline mainly focuses on the growth of Derek Stiles, a very young doctor who hardly knows his way around a scalpel without the help of nurses who guide him and sometimes belittle him. Many of the other nurses and doctors in this game are unusually sassy, but it can be excused since the whole point of the theme for this one is to wake up and smell the coffee. See, Derek starts off as someone who doesn't think so much about the patients, simply getting the job done and moving on very willy-nilly. This causes certain patients to actually have worse side effects post-surgery and serves as a wake-up call to him and his main nurse, Angie Thompson, who start to realize that being a medical worker comes with responsibility few people can handle. They want to be up to the task, and by the end of the game, they earn it by truly showing compassion both in and out of an operation. The overall writing in this one is a little wonky with some very 0 to 10 scenarios, but it does well and even questions bigger moral issues like the euthanization of terminally ill patients, as well as the ethics of taking away a medical license due to issues outside of the provider's hands. Without spoiling too much, because some plot twists are truly out there, the basic structure of each episode is setting the location, dialogue between medical providers, an emergency happens, you operate, and then there's a small ending bit of story before the episode is up. The story builds comfortably just as the DS version does, but they make the odd rush choice to skip the original final altercation, turning it into a boring black screen with text, and probably moving on to the new character, Nozomi Weaver. She's been blacklisted from the industry and is quite angry about it, but she does low-key operations for a shady outside company with poor intentions. There may be an insane virus on the loose, threatening the safety of dozens of Americans, but I'll leave the rest for you to find out. Most of the series is set in the US, ranging from Alaska to Cali to Russia. Atlus USA actually had a lot of control over the releases post Second Opinion, but as for why the series was based in American medicine, well, during the 2000s, Japan had the largest population of elders who were passing away inside of a hospital setting, with very little time to see family, and so, in 2006, the Japanese government implemented the Revised Medical Care Act to increase financial sustainability of the healthcare system. The reform focused on shifting long-term care from in-hospital towards community-based care, meaning that families could do end care from home. This also meant that there was less focus at the time on improving other technologies to help all of the people who were young. In the US, our healthcare has literally been expensive since the 1960s and has only gone up. But we constantly create and distribute new medicines and practices that honestly benefit the young before the old. The second we release, New Blood, has much to say about the commercialization of medicine, but Second Opinion is more focused on the ageist issues. For one, the older doctors in the game are often jaded and care significantly less about the true well-being of the patients, while the fresh-out-of-school providers seem to bend over backwards. Then, the actual patients you have are typically much younger, with doctors working on them with more hope than when working on an older and more ill patient. Lastly, there's a major emphasis on 2018 being much more ideal when it comes to technology, like how we have a gel that can mend bones and cuts. Yes, new technology happens, and it makes gameplay a bit snappier, but why specifically is that in there? Well, at the time of the game's release, there weren't ways to really treat pancreas diseases, and so the game offers a unique take on what sort of device could actually do that by then. Well, guess what? By 2018, the US actually had bio-artificial pancreases available for people with diabetes. So boom. Not quite a prediction of the future, but the scenario writers thought carefully about what would best help people of all ages. Second Opinion was well received and reviewed, pushing Atlus to develop the sequel, New Blood, released in 2007. The game has a surprisingly minimal amount of dev history and creator interviews accessible, but from Second Opinion and on, there was a new director at the helm, named Daisuke Kaneda. Everything about it improved significantly over the last release. It's got HD widescreen, so it's much better looking on a modern flat screen. The menus have also been toned down so that the transition between levels is seamless, with skippable tutorials and all. Gameplay is mostly the same, but Atlus USA also pushed multiplayer, so now we have dual protagonists, a female named Valerie Blaylock and Marcus Vaughn. Dr. Blaylock can be very hot-headed and jealous at the worst of times, but incredibly generous and heroic at her best. Dr. Vaughn wants to be Spike Spiegel and let whatever happen, happen. But his past creeps up on him and threatens that carefree attitude constantly. There's also an awesome nurse named Elena Salazar, who's a total flip from the sassy assistant in Second Opinion. With further developed characters, voice acting becomes a major player now. Big names in the industry like Troy Baker and Karen Strassman are in this and do fantastic as always. For the time, none of the voices are bad in the slightest, and they do wonders for getting you further invested into the very grounded plot lines. One thing I have to mention is that there aren't any audio settings in the game, and maybe it's just me, but it feels like the voices get drowned out by the sound effects and music. It's not the worst thing, I just wish I was able to change that. The story kicks off in a run-down Alaskan hospital with two very gifted doctors. Most patients who end up needing treatment in this location trash the idea of a smaller hospital, which we later find out contributes to the director of the hospital wanting to close up. If they closed, that means quite a large area of people will be lacking medical help. Meanwhile, Dr. Vaughn actually has the healing touch and is supposed to be guiding Dr. Blaylock on how to tap into the power as well. The tension between them tends to stem from this, but things resolve very smoothly and believably halfway through the 10-hour campaign. Yes, the games are rather long, but they never feel long. The idea of a super secret medical power seems like it'd be capitalized on, right? Well, this game offers us an idea of what that'd look like. New Blood is made up of various chapters with different parts inside of them. The middle section of the game is probably my favorite because it explores so many difficult ideas, with one being about a televised show offering free medical treatment as long as the patient allows it to be aired nationally. This means that people who can't afford real healthcare have the opportunity to be under the knife of an artificially famous doctor. It turns out that TV's Dr. Belko has the healing touch, using it for his own profit while outwardly criticizing the company our doctors are working for. They work for Caduceus, the same company Dr. Styles joined up with in the previous game who fight wild viruses. They also happen to be the most well-funded hospital in the area, meaning treatment is very expensive when their technological advances are so vast. Dr. Belko's little stint comes to a close when viewers realize that manipulating these people into lesser quality medicine for entertainment leads to terrible things. But at the same time, these people had nowhere to go. The episode does a good job morally portraying our doctors as calm, thoughtful people with a great amount of empathy, as well as questioning doctors who work for a chunk of change. Still, what are people supposed to do when they can't afford healthcare? One episode reminds me of David Cronenberg's controversial 2022 film, Crimes of the Future, where sexuality becomes entwined with surgery. The film is less about the actual idea of gratification and more about how money and status can replace a basic human need. New Blood is set in 2028, and the episode starts off with a very wealthy boy who puts off a procedure so that it will get worse and cost more money to fix than another boy's surgery. Being able to afford medical help equals a higher status. This is juxtaposed by a poor person who begs the hospital staff to help his son with an emergency appendix issue. Dr. Blaylock shines here, sneakily finding a way to be able to help the man's son without having him pay a single dollar, and going through with the surgery. It's a very real moment, and I'd hate to know the true number of people who end up in a critical condition because of money. The game presents these scenarios and gets even more serious with an assassination virus, but of course, it can't answer how we really change these issues in real life. But that's okay. A storyteller isn't there to fix things, they're there to make us think and hopefully act. With all that, it's my favorite in the series narratively, but also because of just how tense and shocking some of the surgeries are. For example, a sudden car accident that the doctors just happen to see turns out to be a life or death situation. The strict time limit adds to the heightened anxiety when your team has very few tools at their disposal. It's less about fixing them and more about keeping them alive. The trauma formula up to this point is just very well maintained and hardly gets old. Milking the cow further, Atlus started development on a second DS release, a true sequel to Under the Knife, aptly titled Under the Knife 2. Derek Stiles and Angie Thompson are still working with Caduceus to stop crazy viruses and get stationed in Africa post-war. I feel that this game is significantly less remarkable than the two Wii ports when it comes to story. Maybe it's the rapid nature of moving between plot to surgery for handheld play, or maybe it's just the flatter characters. I just don't love this one. Regardless, the gameplay is still fun, even taking things like the defibrillator from the Wii games and adding it in as a new tool. I still believe that touch controls and the stylus are the best feeling controls, so that's really the reason to give this one a shot. The older character models designed by Ikehata get swapped with the designs from Doi, which is a little cold, although logical for the new Trauma series image. The limitations of the DS meant that the voiceovers got snipped significantly, but the music improved tenfold over the original. All in all, Under the Knife 2 is more of the same, and it didn't sell so great because of it. Apparently, Atlus USA felt that things were getting stale and audiences were growing fatigued. So, after rushing out 4 games in the span of 4 years, Atlus slowed their roll and did not release the next and final game until 2010. Trauma Team feels very separate from the others, with an entirely new approach to storytelling, gameplay styles, cutscene animation, really just everything. First of all, the game has multiple characters with entirely different game types and plot lines, and you can access any of them or tutorials from the main screen. You'll notice right away that things look very graphic, like an American comic. The style of art is also very different, but it's actually still Doi's artwork. He really changed it up for this one, though I'm not sure I quite enjoy the look of all the characters. Hank Freebird looks like a superhero, which is part of the plot, but then you put him next to Spike Spiegel and you're just confused. It's a bit of a mess, but it does grow on you. The story is entirely told this way now, and I feel as though the readability suffers a little. There's sometimes too much going on in the other panels, even if they attempt to help this issue by blurring the one you're not on. It's just a lot to look at, and sometimes the panel you're on seems very small. Thankfully for the dyslexic and reading inhibited, there is more voice acting than ever, with the likes of Amanda Wynn Lee and various other Atlus favorites who yet again knock it out the park. The game suggests you start with the character CRS-01, a prisoner convicted of a crime he may not have truly committed. He is very similar to Doctors of the Past, a master surgeon with a crazy gift who learns to be more empathetic as he goes. His gameplay is the norm, difficult during times of panic, using the nunchuck for the tools, the remote for pointing, yada yada yada. He's sort of the glue that holds the other doctors together by the end, crossing paths with all of them more so than in their own scenarios, to offer the remnants of an overarching plot. But Trauma Team is less about a bigger narrative and more about the little things that happen to the lives of hospital staff. One of the other characters, Tomoe Tachibana, is pretty stale. She's very anime, always talking about honor and wearing a yukata under her coat. Most of her story revolves around the difficulties of breaking familial standards and traditions, even covering the difficulties of religion infecting the path of medicine. But Tomoe herself just isn't very interesting. She's so one note, something I can't really say about the other trauma protagonists or even side characters. Gameplay wise, she's an endoscopist, so a doctor who goes in from a hole in the body with a camera and some scary tools to stop bleeding, removing abnormalities, all that. It sort of plays like a dungeon crawler, with pathways that unlock only as you find a certain key problem before first person viewing your way to the next area. It does move a bit awkwardly, shoving the remote forward in the direction you want to go before changing tools comfortably. It's not bad, and her section of the game doesn't go on for too long, thankfully, but there isn't anything here I'm wild about. Maria Torres is a hot-headed first responder. Any emotion she has, she feels 100% and flips to the next feeling on a dime. She can be aggressive and, in turn, a bit unlikable, but she's in a lot of the game because she does have so much personality for the other characters to respond to. Her plot is probably the best one, where she needs to understand when to ask for help and how to work better with a team. Her surgical scenarios are also the most fast-paced and can go to crap very quickly, juggling multiple people at a time with sometimes very few tools to be able to help with. One of the most important tools she has is CPR, and you'll be very familiar with it by the end because your goal is to keep all the patients alive for a given time, juggling between up to 6 people. It gets very real. Hank Freebird is odd. Part of his storyline is about a hot patient who starts to really like him after an attempt on her life. He already seemed to know the worth of life itself, but the story seems to think we need to have it explained to us left and right, so that by the end he can learn again that life is valuable. It's kind of whatever, but one scenario involves a really scary mall shooting, and that just about knocked my socks off. Dr. Freebird is in the orthopedic department, so he works on the spine. His levels are very precision-focused, mainly having you use the laser, a drill, and a scalpel. You have to keep up the vitals as usual, but the way you truly fail is by making too many mistakes. You must get that aim just right to pull it off, which, in this game, is less sensitive than the past 2 console releases, making it much easier. His sections aren't very difficult, so they don't exactly get you to the same heightened heart rate past surgeries could, unfortunately. The last 2 characters are total departures from the surgery scene, with Gabriel Cunningham being in charge of diagnosing patients. It sort of turns the game into an active visual novel mixed with LA Noire, where a patient sits down and talks to you as you ask questions that will help you figure out what's wrong with them. You have to really look at their body language, the way they're saying things, as well as finding weird little spikes in their charts. It's a nice change of pace, but sometimes it takes way too freaking long on just one patient, to the point that you have save states. This jerk just doesn't want to tell you anything about his body, and he sure as hell won't let you touch him, so the process takes literally an hour if not more. I do feel as though Trauma Team suffers from too much dialogue. And still, characters like Cunningham don't really have some grand meaning, so why are we spending so much time with him if a good chunk is not gameplay? I feel like the game struggles with the balance, and that's really my main issue. The marketing team of Atlus USA did an interview with A-List just after the launch of Trauma Team, and their main goal was to create a simplistic narrative because
the sci-fi elements introduced towards the latter portions of the previous games typically seem to polarize the game's fan bases. On the one hand, many gamers seem to enjoy the departure into fantasy, perhaps because the notion of serious medicine was something they didn't want to explore in escapist entertainment. On the other hand, and it seems as though this group was the majority, many gamers seemed a bit alienated by the sudden appearance of, well, aliens.
even if the game steps away from the earth-shattering viruses of old, I do feel like the more humanist plots they've stuck with are written with much less quality than New Blood. I genuinely feel that the lacking story mixed with new gameplay types that are a little long-winded killed what could have been a new wave of future releases, specifically with the final character. She is a returning character from Second Opinion who I hardly recognized, now going by Naomi Kimishima. She works in forensics, going directly to crime scenes and analyzing the body, the scene, and puts clues together until they logically make sense. It plays very much like the out-of-court scenes in Ace Attorney, or more poignantly, the Miles Edgeworth games, which are now on Switch, by the way. Buy them, so they'll port the 3DS games. If you thought the Cunningham stuff took too long, her scenarios can literally take 2 hours. I was dying. It is such a slog. Even if I really enjoyed what I was doing at first, it just gets old. It seems like the evidence repeats itself 10 times before letting you just fill in the blanks to solve the case. I think the true charm of Team is how unique each character plays and behaves, allowing every player to enjoy a different thing about it. It was an interesting idea on Atlus's part, I just don't think it exactly stuck the landing. While I can't find sales numbers, I won't say it didn't perform up to snuff, although I do know it cost them the most to develop. So maybe that's why they never made more. But the future of the series is terribly grim, with no Wii U port, no 3DS release, and worst of all, no Switch drop. Anything that touches the Switch seems to get at least some level of success. Even Another Code got a remake. The Switch is where a series can get a second wind, but not Trauma Center. It's a bummer, but I will make the case that it's a better outcome. When I think about how excited I was for Soul Hackers 2 versus what I got, or I remember how hopeful I was for the possibility of Catherine Full Body either having a sequel snuck inside of it or spawning a new release. Again, versus what I got, I don't know. So many OG Atlus creatives are still on these projects, and it just never feels as magical as it used to be. I'm not going to go super into explaining why those titles disappoint me, but it mainly comes down to very little nuance and sloppy mechanics or writing. It seems forced, and that's why I prefer new things from Atlus now. Even if I believe that a well-written Trauma Center game could literally shatter our minds with how thought-provoking it could get with our current political climate. But maybe it's like what Neil Young said.
Sometimes it's better to burn out than to fade away.